English translation 604th contact Thursday, the 18th of December 2014, 17:33 hours.
Excuse me, but I was still busy in the kitchen after the correction work, which means that I was amusing myself with something edible. But right at the beginning I have something to ask, namely whether it would be possible for you to say a few words about the character, morals and convictions of the German Chancellor Angela Merkel in an apolitical but clarifying way, which could then also be made official.
So you have a question to ask, which means that it does not come from you, so I cannot go into it if you do not make it clear by yourself. I would also like to tell you that I have some important things to do together with Enjana and Florina until Sunday, so I will be present in the Saul area until then. So if you have something to discuss with me, I can come here anytime. I would also like to draw your attention to an error in the 598th contact conversation, which has to be corrected because a word was not printed. But I will explain this to you later in a private way, because there is still something to be discussed in this way.
Well, that's good, because it might come up that I might have something to talk about with you. So let's be surprised. And according to what you said about my question, of course you are right and I formulated it accordingly, because I know that you do not want to go into it and because I do not want to trick you. I also think, and I must say this, that the real private side of women should be judged according to their political machinations, because there can be no big difference here. When I look only at how she behaves and performs, how she has bypassed the interests of the people, how she has not yet brought any valuable innovations or benefits for the good of the people, but has only been selfishly swinging her scepter, then I think of what we too have often talked about with regard to the degenerations of today's people, especially politicians and many young people and young adults. So I compare them in this respect with those young people and young adults of today who, since 1982, have been daring out in such a way that they have become antisocial in some way. Only incur debts or perform a job without joy solely for the sake of the disdainful mammon, which must also be quite highly paid. However, they do not care in any way about the welfare and woe of their family members, friends or fellow human beings, but only about their own failed welfare and about their joys and addictions, etc., as Angela Merkel does this only for the sake of her power. They do not care about the course of the world or the climate either, nor do they care about Merkel, for how else would it be that she tries to force Russia to its knees in a completely wrong way with sanctions, just as she does not do anything positive about climate change, nor about decisive birth control, because nowadays excessive overpopulation on Earth is the origin of all existing evils and catastrophes of all kinds. In effect, it truly cares only for its power and its satisfaction in this regard, as do in other degenerate ways many of today's young people and young adults who do inhuman things and sometimes do not even strive for their own well-being. This especially if they are addicted to alcohol or drugs or to terrorism, as in the case of the IS or Islamist state. They behave like uncultivated savages, rob their fellow human beings, beat them up for pure joy and pleasure, and often until their victims become crippled or die, whereby the murder of fellow human beings by the bloody terrorism of the IS stands out especially, to which unstable, alien, or incapable young people fall into love who become sectarian, delusional, and terrorist, radicalized into murderous fanaticism and then finally freak out. Every good sense of community and social behavior is something foreign to them, as are humanity, love, and true freedom, as well as peace and harmony.
Your honesty does not allow this either, and in fact, I do not want to get involved with foreign questions, but I can agree with your answer, which you yourself gave. Lately, I have noticed that you often talk about statements that relate to political issues, especially with regard to the EU and the US. Why is that?
Well, on the one hand, I often receive articles from Achim Wolf about the political machinations of the EU and the USA, which of course interest me, and about which I am as concerned as all the world events that are broadcast on television, news, and radio. So I pick the relevant facts apart and form my opinion according to the information and news I get, which I then discuss with you and which I of course also reproduce in the bulletins upon request. This has nothing to do with politicization, but only with the free formation of opinion and the representation of opinion.
I can understand that, and understand that you cannot be reproached for politicizing. Because a free opinion and its open representation has nothing to do with politicizing, nor with intervening in politics.
As I said, I see it the same way myself.
It would also be incomprehensible to me if you were politically active.
My profession is to remain politically neutral, because only in this way can I find the possibility of rethinking political issues and machinations in a neutral and sensible way, so that I can then form my opinion in the same way as I do with regard to the EU, the USA, and the German Chancellor. Angela Merkel, as German Chancellor and key spokeswoman in EU dictatorship policy, is not only driven by a strong greed for power as a leader of the state, but also as a human being, as unfortunately is the case with the majority of leading politicians of both sexes. Within the framework of the EU dictatorship, which must rightly be seen as the fourth world power alongside the USA, Russia, and China, this woman exercises a tremendous power and also fascinates her fellow Mongers. It also follows from this that, as is the case with regard to the wrong and nasty behavior towards Russia, dangerous accusations, measures, and sanctions which promote discord are taken and implemented. In the present case, this is also the case, because the EU is looking at Ukraine and wants to incorporate it into its EU dictatorship area. Greedy for power in order to have a direct bastion in front of Russia. But Russia will not tolerate this and will not allow itself to be brought to its knees. There will also inevitably be an unpleasant reaction from Russia with regard to NATO, because it also wants to invade Ukraine, which will make Russia feel all the more threatened by the West and the EU, as I see it. However, Russia, currently ruled by Putin, will not allow itself to be intimidated, but will demonstrate some kind of strength that the EU dictatorship and the USA will not like. It is to be feared, however, that the idiocy and childishness of the EU dictatorship and the USA may lead to something that may be extremely unpleasant for Europe and America. The EU dictatorship, and above all the German Chancellor Merkel, blames Russia with accusations and finger-pointing which are completely unjustified on the one hand, and which ultimately conceal a boundless megalomaniacal greed for power and expansion on the part of this woman and all her submissives and the powerful of the EU and the USA on the other. In addition to Merkel and her EU trobants, the USA also plays a particularly lousy role, because, as you said, and as we both agree, there has been a Cold War between Russia, the USA, and the EU dictatorship for quite some time now, which has become the fourth world power group thanks to the participation of the USA. Not only we both see it this way, but also other reasonable thinking people, as the following articles sent to me prove.
Russia as an enemy the wrong way.
Peace leads only through the unity and democratic self-determination of the folks behind the recriminations and accusations of the EU. And NATO lies a boundless greed for power and expansion on the part of Europe's powerful, whose presumption and delusions of grandeur seem to bury any sense of partnership among peoples, equality, equivalence, respect, decency, and dignity. So the EU apparatus, which is contemptuous of democracy and humanity, together with all its hypocritical bosses, is far more like a dictatorial Moloch that threatens to devour everything than Russia, which feels pushed against the wall by the West and rightly resists the audacious interference of Western power alliances. Certainly there is no danger from the reasonable and prudent citizens of Russia and Europe, because they are basically geared towards peace, reconciliation, and equal coexistence, which, however, as always, the rulers are overriding in an autocratic and irresponsible way. The West should not attack and discredit Russia, but should grab its own nose. For here, in the highly acclaimed Golden West, one of the biggest acts of fraud and enslavement against the people of Europe is underway through the criminal machinations of the EU dictatorship, which amounts to a totalitarian system of government and surveillance under the guise of alleged freedom. But the people of the European peoples are themselves to blame for everything, because they leave the incompetent rulers and powerful in power, and do not take their destinies into their own hands in a truly democratic way. The only sensible and right thing is that one day the people will stand up, hold together, and thus determine their own destinies. To do that, the people have to unite themselves. The initiative must therefore come from the people, but that will probably only be when they are fed up with the tyranny and dictatorship of the rulers. The whole thing would then have to happen in any form without violence, that is to say, without bloodshed. Therefore, one can only enlighten in these things and remind people of their own responsibility. A true democracy cannot be enforced, for the people themselves must be so far advanced that they take care of their own interests in all things, and do not leave everything to the power-hungry politicians. How important Russia will ever be for future world peace is also shown by the contact reports and prophetic statements of Billy Edouard Albert Meyer. As a reminder, a passage from the FIGU Bulletin number 34, published in April 2007, should be quoted in this connection, which should give both the rulers and the ordinary people food for thought. In FIGU Bulletin number 1 of April 1995, Billy wrote the following in an article on FIGU's assistance to Russia. Because I know very well that this country and its people are the ones from which real peace will come for many peoples. A fact that began to come true with Gorbachev, Glasnost, Perestroika, and the abolition of communism. Already, the sleeping prophet Edgar Cayce wrote the following words about this. Out of Russia's development, greater hope will grow for the world. Then the one in the group who have closer ties with Russia will be able to achieve step-by-step changes and the definitive definitions of conditions in respect of the world rule. Achim Wolff, Germany.
America sets the tone in everything, Gorbachev. We have long been in a Cold War, and the USA is to blame for it. Friday, 12.12. 2014, 10:34 hours.
Ex-Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev clearly turns against the USA. Are we in the midst of a new Cold War? Of course they are, he says, and the Americans are to blame. You would have hurt the pride of his homeland for decades.
DPA Mikhail Gorbachev at the commemoration of the 25th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Are we in the midst of another Cold War? Of course we will, says former Russian statesman and Nobel Peace Prize winner Mikhail Gorbachev in an interview with Time magazine. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the West tried to transform Russia into a province, complains Gorbachev. Our nation could not let that happen. It is not just about pride. It's about a situation where people talk to you the way they want and impose limitations. America sets the tone in everything. With control through the crisis. The dominance of the USA is frustrating, says the statesman. Instead of recognizing Russia as an equal partner, the West would try to exclude the country from politics. This was particularly evident in the Ukraine crisis. Kremlin leader Vladimir Putin took the initiative and annexed the Crimea. He tried to restore some of Russia's lost influence. In an interview with the magazine, Gorbachev frankly admits that there are elements of autocracy, authoritarianism in Russia. But this is the fault of former allies and friends who pushed Moscow out of geopolitics. Because only through control would one be able to get over this crisis. America cannot be trusted now. Gorbachev calls on the USA to seek a new, more friendly relationship with Russia. But at the same time, he warns, I have learned that you can listen to the Americans, but you cannot trust them. Nevertheless, the world must return to dialogue. In an article in the government newspaper Rossiyskaya Gazeta, Gorbachev also called for an international special summit on the Ukraine crisis. Putin and U.S. President Barack Obama must prevent another catastrophic loss of confidence, wrote the ex-Soviet president. In addition, the European Union and Russia should also try to defrost the frozen relations at a meeting.
The consequences of the mishandling by the USA and the EU dictatorship will still be very unpleasant.
I think so, because the consequences cannot be avoided, both on the part of Russia and on the part of the EU dictatorship, and the people in particular will have to suffer again. Because the rulers are always the cowardly elements who loll about in their armchairs and live a good and safe life, while the people have to hold their heads to the bangs. For me, this is as sure as the amen in a prayer, which means that's how it is.
That's the way it is.
Then I want to say something about the so-called assassins, which existed before. These were hired assassins and political murderers who also acted as mercenaries, belonged to a secret society sect and committed political murders, etc., usually in the name of Persian and Oriental rulers and other degenerate, murderous, sectarian, and power madmen. I have spent some time informing myself about this in Persia, and recently found out that today the murdering creatures of the IS or Islamist state dehumanized in Iraq and Syria can also be described as assassins and their ringleaders as the head killers of this gang of criminals. This mass murderer, who calls himself the head of the bloodthirsty IS extremists Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, was, to my knowledge, born in 1971 and is actually called Ibrahim Awad Ibrahim al-Badri. He proclaimed himself a caliph, and as a self-proclaimed caliph he called on the Sunnis to join the completely misunderstood jihad, whereby his murderous motive is hatred against the Shiites. Rightly, the jihad, also called jihad, is basically to be understood as an effort, struggle, effort and commitment in relation to one's own conscious-minded emotional psychological development, and in no way has anything to do with war, bloodshed, torture, murder, and terrorism, as the IS does to the contrary in degenerate form. A week after the head of the Iraqi extremists, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, appointed himself caliph of his Islamic State, he delivered a sermon in the large Sunni Nuri Mosque of Mosul. With it he had put aside his pretended restraint, and for the first time showed himself in public in the way he really is. He said, "Unlike the kings and rulers, I do not promise you luxury, security, and relaxation. Instead, I promise you what Allah has promised his true believers." At the same time, he called on the Sunnis to join him in the jihad, the holy war, and to settle in his self-proclaimed caliphate, which stretches from the east of Syria to deep into central Iraq. He also torched that he would restore the dignity, power, and rights of the Sunnis. Many influential Sunni scholars and preachers, for example the Egyptian Yusuf Qaradawi, who lives in Qatar, as well as well-known extremists, have sharply criticized the appearance of the self-proclaimed caliph since then. And the fact is that a caliphate cannot be founded by a madman or a group simply proclaiming it. Various scholars, priests, Arab rulers, and states deny the Islamist state any legitimation. Of course, this does not change the fact that Baghdadi's performance is more than just a propaganda coup. Effectively, his current position of terrorist power is the temporary high point in his terrorist career, which began around the turn of the millennium in Samarra, north of Baghdad. And I think he brewed his gang of murderers together within the framework of the old assassins, because they worked as hired murderers, mass killers, religious killers, sect killers, and political killers. How do you feel about that?
You can say that like that because the IS murder gangs are actually like the old assassin mercenaries. They were just as unscrupulous and blood and murderous as the fanatical, radicalized and dehumanized IS militias, which can only be dealt with by force, because in their degeneration neither reason nor humanity can be addressed.
Baghdadi also claims that he descends from the tribe of Quraysh, or from the tribe of the Prophet Muhammad. Besides, I do not want to forget, there is one who has allegedly been released by the IS militias and returned home to Europe. I cannot take this as truth because it is known that the IS courts, which are carried out, condemn the delinquents consistently to death. So it cannot be that a person is released and sent home again by the IS, unless he is fanaticized and radicalized by a brainwashing as a sleeper.
In a biography spread by jihadists, Baghdadi actually claims that his ancestry can be traced back to the Quraysh, that is to say, to the tribe of the Prophet Muhammad, which, however, corresponds to a conscious lie. And what you say about Sleeper, I agree.
Baghdadi is said to have obtained a doctorate in Islamic law at the University of Baghdad, and to have later worked as a preacher in Samarra, where he had already at that time dealt with terrorist ideas, which the Americans are said to have become aware of.
This corresponds to correctness, because already at that time he dealt with extremely fanatical and terrorist radical ideas, whereby he deepened these after the invasion of the Americans in the year 2003 still abysmally. So the Americans arrested him and put him in the Bucca prison camp in southern Iraq for about 3 years. Shortly after his release from Bucca in 2009, Baghdadi's criminal rise among the fanatical radical extremists began, after which only a year later he became the leader of the Organization of the Islamist State in Iraq, founded by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, whose successor, Omar al-Baghdadi, was killed in an American air raid. The extremists seemed to be nearing their end, but when the American soldiers left Iraq, Baghdadi managed to revive the terrorist network. In recent years, Baghdadi not only showed his malicious nefariousness, but he also proved that he could show off a strategic foresight. He systematically attacked prisons in Iraq, such as the infamous Abu Ghraib detention facility west of Baghdad, succeeding in freeing hundreds of fanatical radical extremists who had practically all committed murder. They are the ones who today carry out their inhuman and bloody craft at the forefront of the murder units. Through many murders and bomb attacks, he has driven his opponents into weariness, especially the Shiite government, which he despises as deeply as the Shiite faithful. His vendetta and conquest plans were financed not only by rich financiers in the Gulf, but also by the smuggling of oil, which he stole in Syria and Iraq, where he conquered the oil drilling rigs through his murder gangs. He also claims protection money and, of course, absolute power in every respect.
Baghdadi despises and hates the whole Western world. And since he is deluded into building a world of God through his murder gangs according to his delusional scheme, he also represents a danger to the whole world. The murder and destruction rage of Baghdadi against the Shiites in their mosques and other sanctuaries is only the foundation stone of God's world madness, because he also hates all other religions and sects which cannot be reconciled with his madness. But look here, there is something else I have, just regarding the assassins that I have spoken about. I would like to show you these excerpts from the internet regarding the assassins, because they are quite informative and certainly interesting for all people who read our conversation reports.
Excerpts from the internet.
In the Middle Ages, the Nizarites were known as assassins, a group of the Ismailite 7 Shiites who committed political assassinations at that time and were therefore as feared as they were surrounded by legends. Centers in the mountains of Persia and Syria. Through reports from crusaders and later travelers, they also became known in Europe. The Nizarites who still exist today emerged from a dispute over the rightful succession of the Fatimidic Imam Caliph al-Mustansir plus 1094, their current head being Karim Aga Khan IV. Marco Polo described the assassins as a sect that consumed hashish, celebrated orgiastic feasts, and committed dagger and poison murders on high-ranking personalities. He kept himself vague with the sources, however, and according to today's scientific assessment, he mostly reproduced stories he had heard himself. The period of the assassin's activity was subsequently limited to the years between 1080 and 1270. The word assassin probably goes back to the regular consumption of hashish after assassinations attributed to the sect but not proven,
via the colloquial plural form Hasisiyun or Hasasin derived from Arabic shish h, DMG hasis, herbs, grasses, hemp, cannabis sativa. It is also possible, however, that the word was a term that was common in Syria at that time, a term that was dignified or a general term for the raptured. Originally only the Syrian residents of the Sufi sect of the Assassin Arab, Anais =, the people of the foundations, the fundamentalists, and only later all members of the religious community were so called. English and various Romance languages have derived the verb for assassination from the assassin approach. English to assassinate, Italian assassinare, French assassinaire, Spanish assassinar, Portuguese assassinaire, Catalan assassinar, Romanian assassinare. History after the death of the sixth Shiite Imam, Ja'far as-Sadiq, in 765, they did not recognize Musa al-Kazim, but Ismail as their legal successor, and so another group, the Ismailites, split off from the Imamites and went their own ways. Gradually a sect was formed which was characterized by very special beliefs, a strict organization and strong inner cohesion. The Imam remained the spiritual leader of this community, and deists appeared as missionaries. The Ismailites, who were not recognized by other Muslims, worked in secret and saw beside the literal message of the Quran a deeper hidden message, which was to be revealed to ordinary people by scholars. Thus, especially in the beginnings of the faith community, a scholastic connection of Greek philosophy and Islamic mysticism, Sufism, arose. The weaker the Abbasid Caliphate, the stronger the Ismailites became. In the 10th century, this finally led to the emergence of an Ismailite empire in North Africa, the Fatimid Empire. It lasted almost 200 years until 1171. When the Fatimidic Imam Khalif al-Mustansir died in 1094, his sons Nizar and al-Mustali fought over his succession, while the more moderate followers of al-Mustali, who was able to assert himself as the new Fatimid Caliph, gave rise to the grouping of the Bohra Ismailites. The more radical followers of Nizar formed the Nizari Ismailites Nizarites, which were soon also called assassins. The famous leader of the Persian Ismailites, Hassani Sabah, also positioned himself for Nizar at that time. The assassins in Persia. In the late 11th century, Hassani Sabah *Ka, 1034 in Qum, died 1124, a prominent propagandist da'i, began to missionize in northern Persia. In 1081, he traveled to Isfahan and the high mountain region of Dailam. There his religious views fell on fertile ground. The Oberda was able to win a large number of followers and bring his own territory with several castles under his rule. Alamut Castle became the center of this principality. He came into conflict with the Seljuk rulers. In 1092, they set a first military expedition against the Ismailites in motion. The first political murder by the Ismailites has been handed down from this year. A Fidai consecrated, literally victim, stabbed the Seljuk vizier Nizam al-Mulk on the 17th of October. Marco Polo reported about Hassani Sabah, the great assassin, that he drugged young men with opium and then brought them to a garden attached to Alamut Castle. There, with good hospitality and care by women, they were treated like in the paradise promised by the Prophet Muhammad. Finally, they were anesthetized again and brought to the lord of the castle, who trained them to become Fidai. Only through their heroic death, so the story goes, should they return to paradise. While Hassan-i Sabah and his two successors appeared after Nizar's death 1095 as deputies of the absent Imam with the title Hujjah, the fourth Nizarite prince of Alamut, Hassan II, declared himself Imam and announced in a spectacular ceremony that the long-awaited last day had now come and a new time had dawned. Furthermore, the idea developed that Hassan was a descendant of Nizar and thus a descendant of the Fatimids and ultimately of Muhammad. The Imam dynasty of Alamut continued until 1256, when the Mongols ended the rule of the Nizarites in Persia. Hulegu, a grandson of Genghis Khan, first negotiated with the last head of the sect, Ruken ad-Din Chorshah, in order not to wear out his powers during the siege of the Assassin castles. The castles, including the main castle Alamut, were taken and destroyed. The extensive library of scientific writings was burned. However, the secretary of the Khan was able to take 3 books with him, including the biography of Hassan-i Saba, which he added to his account of the conquests of the Khan. From these sources and the resulting narratives, Marco Polo's report on the assassins could be derived. Under the pretext of capturing the fortified men, the Mongolian governor had the assassins come together and allegedly murdered many of them. The descendants of the Imam Ruken ad-Din Chorshah remained hidden after the fall of Alamut, emigrated with their followers from Persia, and finally reappeared under the title Aga Khan-si Nizaris. The assassins in Syria, Masyaf Castle, Courtyard, Masyaf Castle, the domain of the Syrian assassins between the Principality of Antioch and the county of Tripoli. By 1100, emissaries from Alamut began missionizing northern Syria, where the Ismailite sect was already well established. The state's fragmentation and the shock of conquest by the Crusaders made people receptive to a messianic ideology. After several unsuccessful attempts, the Nizarites were able to buy or appropriate some castles so that they could build their own dominion in the Jebel Ansariya mountain range. In 1140, the assassins conquered their headquarters, Masyaf Castle. By 1150, the most famous assassin, the so-called Old of the Mountain, Rashid ad-Din Sinan, 1133–1193, became ruler in Masyaf. He was able to further consolidate the position of the assassins in Syria through a successful swing policy between Saladin and Crusaders. He also gained the independence of his principality from Alamut. By 1230, the assassins had achieved general social recognition as territorial rulers. This is shown, among other things, by the fact that they officially paid tribute to the Order of St. John. The assumption of power by the Mamluk Sultan Baybars in the second half of the 13th century changed the situation. Baybars did not want to tolerate any independent sect that might turn against him in his kingdom. Already in 1260, he appointed one of his generals as feudal lord of the assassins' area. In 1271, his rule was so strong that the assassin leaders had to hand over their castles and could be forced to live at Baybar's court in the future. That was the de facto end of the assassin regime. Procedure and prominent victims of the assassins. The assassins used political murder as their main weapon. The murder weapon was the dagger. The assassins saw themselves as martyrs and accepted their own death. For their time enjoyed, it was incomprehensible that they did not make an escape attempt after a murder and expose themselves to the revenge of supporters of the murdered. The assassins acted according to a strong ideological conviction. They wanted to restore the God state, that is to say, the Islamic basic order as the Prophet Muhammad had left it. In their view, the current order had been usurped by tyrants. Their main opponents were the Seljuk rulers of the 12th and 13th centuries. Most of the assassin victims were Sunni Muslims, including celebrities such as the Seljuk vizier Nizam al-Mulk. Sultan Saladin was also the target of several attacks that were not completed. Christians were largely spared until the middle of the 12th century, except for Raymond II, Count of Tripoli, and Conrad of Montferrat, King of Jerusalem, who may have been murdered at the instigation of Richard the Lionheart. The assassins appear as assassins in numerous media. In the video game series Assassin's Creed, For example, they are depicted as a secret society that existed before the Crusades and is still active today. The player assumes the role of an assassin and fights against the Templars. In 2003, ZDF produced a documentary about the assassins in the Terra X series.
I am familiar with these explanations, but they are certainly valuable information for those Earth humans who have no knowledge of these facts.
Then a question about the Dutch painter Vincent van Gogh. He was a maniac and plagued by depression. He is said to have killed himself, was reported earlier, but today this is denied by forensicists who say that everything indicates that he was murdered. According to testimonies, Van Gogh dragged himself back to his accommodation, seriously injured, where he was questioned by the police, including whether he had sustained the gunshot wound himself, to which he is said to have replied, "I think so." That does not seem to me to indicate that he did it consciously, because he might have been in some kind of delirium and didn't know how he got shot. Anyway, I don't think it sounds like murder or suicide to my ears. Something just can't be right about the whole thing. But here I have copied some from the internet, which is certainly interesting. Have you perhaps dealt with this matter, and can you perhaps say something about it, if I read you these excerpts?
Let's hear what's written.
Well then.
Excerpts from the Internet.
The death of Vincent van Gogh, 1853 to 1890, is the stuff of legends. The painter, who suffered from depression and increasing madness, died on the 29th of July, 1890, on a wheat field by a shot in the chest. Now an expert provides forensic evidence to speak against suicide. The suicide theory of the painter driven by genius and madness is still not completely dispelled. It may be obvious, after all, Van Gogh had already done violence to himself once and cut off his left ear. But already in 2011, the Pulitzer Prize winners Stephen Knife and Gregory White Smith published a book about Vincent van Gogh in which they questioned the circumstances of the Dutchman's death. What the authors lacked was the expertise of a forensic scientist who supported their explanation. Now the coroner, Dr. Vincent Di Maio, has delivered it. He evaluated the historical descriptions of Van Gogh's gunshot wound and says, "In all medical probability, the wound was not inflicted by Van Gogh himself." In other words, he didn't shoot himself. There is said to have been a brown and purple color around the wound. Until now, historians had assumed that the coloring had been caused by gunpowder, as Van Gogh could only have held the gun in his chest in the immediate vicinity. Di Maio says to the colorings, their existence or non-existence says nothing at all. He told Vanity Fair that purple discolorations under the skin were caused by bleeding when a ball tears the organic vessels of the human body and the human being is still alive for a while. The brown ring around the wound is merely a skin abrasion, as can be seen in all gunshot wounds. It only occupies the entrance of the bullet, says Di Maio. Last but not least, Di Maio doubts that Vincent van Gogh could have shot himself so easily into the left side of his chest as a left-handed man. Moreover, there is no historical evidence of possible traces of gunpowder or gunpowder on the painter's hands. In their book, Stephen Knife and Gregory White Smith already put together clues that spoke against suicide. For example, there was the neighbor boy René Secretan, who had a gun but had handled it clumsily. The 16-year-old had also met more frequently with Vincent van Gogh. In addition, the painter ordered paints a few days before his death, which speaks against a planned suicide. With his serious gunshot wound, Vincent van Gogh dragged himself 2 kilometers from the wheat field back to the village. He said he shot himself. Maybe he saw the shot as a welcome way out of his mental misery. At the same time, protecting the true perpetrators would suit the painter, said Van Gogh Connoisseur's Daily Mail. 29 hours after the bullet entered the left chest, Vincent van Gogh died. Whoever shot him remains at large.
Everything is based on empty and false assumptions, which are very unfortunate. The fact is that Van Gogh neither committed suicide, nor was he murdered because the incident was the result of an unfortunate accident. My father Svath clarified the matter at the time and found that Vincent van Gogh suffered not only from the onset of insanity, but also from a strong persecution mania, which was the reason why he obtained a weapon and always carried it with him in a hidden way. On the 27th of July, 1890, when he went out to the surroundings of the village in which he had found shelter, he set up his easel, to which he had attached a small self-made tray, and placed his weapon on it so that it could be quickly at hand should someone attack him. What then happened was that the gun had a misfire and hit the bullet Van Gogh as he stepped carelessly in front of the barrel of the gun, explicitly at the moment the misfire occurred. So he did not want to kill himself, but the whole thing resulted from an unfortunate coincidence based on carelessness.
That probably explains his answer, I think so, when he was questioned by the police. The handguns at that time weren't foolproof yet, so it's easy to imagine that Van Gogh's gun suddenly had a misfire or self-ignition and the shot went off, which hit him, which he died of almost 30 hours later.
Then the following is still to be discussed privately.
Good to know, because...
Now, dear friend, I must return to my task, so farewell and call when necessary. Goodbye.
Then so be it. Farewell and goodbye, my friend.